In this video, we are going to learn about Micturition. Our learning objectives include functional anatomy of the bladder, describe the measurement of bladder function and cystometrogram, then describe the neural control of the bladder, then list disorders of bladder function. So let's learn some important terms associated with this topic like cystometrogram. Cystometrogram is a chart generated from cystometry, which measure contractile force of the bladder when voiding. The chart plots the volume of liquid in the bladder against intravesical pressure. Then micturition reflex. Micturition contractions induced by a stretch reflex initiated by sensory stretch receptors in the bladder wall. Then ureterorenal reflex. Blockage of the ureter leading to a sympathetic reflex to constrict the renal arterioles, thereby decreasing urine output from the kidney. Micturition is the process by which the urinary bladder empties when it becomes filled. This involves two main steps. First, the bladder fills progressively until the tension in its walls rises above a threshold level. This elicits the second step, which is a nurse reflex called the micturition reflex that empties the bladder, or if this fails, at least causes a conscious desire to urinate. Although the micturition reflex is an autonomic spinal cord reflex, it can also be inhibited or facilitated by centers in the cerebral cortex or brainstem. Next topic, physiological anatomy of the bladder. The urinary bladder is a smooth muscle chamber composed of two main parts: the body, which is the major part of the bladder in which urine collects, and the neck, which is a funnel shaped extension of the body, passing interiorly and anteriorly into the urinogenital triangle and connecting with the urethra. The lower part of the bladder neck is also called the posterior urethra because of its relation to its urethra. The smooth muscle of the bladder is called the detrusor muscle. Its muscle fibers extend in all directions and when contracted can increase the pressure in the bladder to 40 to 60 mmHg. This contraction of the detrusor muscle is a major step in emptying the bladder. Smooth muscle cells of the detrusor muscle fuse with one another so that low resistance electrical pathway exists from one muscle cell to the other. Therefore, an action potential can spread throughout the detrusor muscle from one muscle cell to the next to cause contraction of the entire bladder at once. On the posterior wall of the bladder, lying immediately above the bladder neck, is a small triangular area called a trigone. At the lowermost apex of the trigone are the bladder neck opens into the posterior urethra and the two ureters enter the bladder at the uppermost angles of the trigone. The trigone can be identified by the fact that it is a mucosa, the inner lining of the bladder is smooth in contrast to the remaining bladder mucosa, which is folded to form rugae. R-U-G-A-E. Each ureter as it enters the bladder courses obliquely through the detrusor muscle and then passes another 1 to 2 cm beneath the bladder mucosa before emptying into the bladder. The bladder neck or posterior urethra is 2 to 3 cm long and its wall is composed of detrusor muscle interlaced with a large amount of elastic tissue. The muscle in this area is called the internal sphincter. Its natural tone normally keeps the bladder neck and posterior urethra empty of urine and therefore prevents emptying of the bladder until the pressure in the main part of the bladder rises above a critical threshold. Beyond the posterior urethra, the urethra passes through the urinogenital diaphragm, which contains a layer of muscle called the external sphincter of the bladder. This muscle is a voluntary skeletal muscle. It, in contrast to the muscles of the bladder body and bladder neck, which is entirely smooth muscle, the External sphincter muscle is under voluntary control of the nerve system and can be used to consciously prevent urination even when involuntary controls are attempting to empty the bladder. Then, innervation of the bladder. The principal nerve supply of the bladder is by way of a pelvic nerve which connect with the spinal cord through the sacral plexus, mainly connecting with cord segments S2 and S3. Coursing through the pelvic nerves are both sensory nerve fibers and motor nerve fibers. The sensory fibers detect the degree of stretch in the bladder wall. Stretch signals from the posterior urethra are especially strong and are mainly responsible for initiating the reflexes that cause bladder emptying. The motor nerves transmitted in the pelvic nerves are parasympathetic fibers. These fibers terminate on ganglion cells located in the walls of the bladder. Short postganglionic nerves then innervate the detrusor muscle. In addition to the pelvic nerves, two other types of innervation are important in bladder function. Most important are the skeletal motor fibers transmitted through the pudendal nerve to the external bladder sphincter. These fibers are somatic nerve fibers that innervate and control the voluntary skeletal muscle of the sphincter. Also, the bladder receives sympathetic innervation from the sympathetic chain through the hypogastric nerves connecting mainly with the L2 segment of the spinal cord. The sympathetic fibers stimulate mainly the blood vessels and have little to do with bladder contraction. Some sensory nerve fibers also pass by way of the sympathetic nerves and may be important in the sensation of fullness and in some instances pain. We try to learn about the anatomy of urinary bladder in males and females. There are some regions like ureters, ureteric openings, internal sphincter, urinogenital diaphragm including external sphincter and urethra, and some detrusor muscles are there, trigyn is there, prostate gland is associated in case of male, and the bulbourethral gland will be there, and external urethral opening. And innervation of the urinary bladder is a different concept. There will be sympathetics, parasympathetics, pudendal nerves associated with this, which connect with ureter, the body of this urinary bladder, then trigyn region, bladder neck or posterior urethra, and external sphincter. These three sympathetic, parasympathetic, and pudendal nerves connect with this all regions. Like sympathetic nerves connect to the ureter, its body region, and trigyn, but parasympathetics connect with all this body and bladder neck region or posterior urethra, but pudendal nerves just connect with the external sphincter only. Then transport of urine from the kidney through the ureters and into the bladder. Urine that is expelled from the bladder has essentially the same composition as fluid flowing out of the collecting ducts. There are no significant changes in the composition of urine as it flows through the renal calyces and ureters to the bladder. Urine flowing from the collecting ducts into the renal calyces stretches the calyces and increases their inherent pacemaker activity, which in turn initiates peristaltic contractions that spread to the renal pelvis and then downward along the length of the ureter, thereby forcing urine from the renal pelvis toward the bladder. In adults, the ureters are normally 25 to 35 centimeter or 10 inches long. The walls of the ureters contain smooth muscles and are innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves as well as by an intramural plexus of neurons and nerve fibers that extend along the entire length of the ureters. As with other visceral smooth muscles, peristaltic contractions in the ureter are enhanced by parasympathetic stimulation and inhibited by sympathetic stimulation. The ureters enter the bladder through the detrusor muscles in the trigyn region of the bladder. Normally, the ureters goes obliquely for several centimeters through the bladder wall. The normal tone of the detrusor muscles in the bladder wall tends to tends to compress the ureter, thereby preventing backflow or reflux of urine from the bladder when pressure builds up in the bladder during micturition or bladder compression. Once again, the ureters enter the bladder through the detrusor muscles in the trigyn region of the bladder. We know that. Normally, the ureters course obliquely for several centimeters through the bladder wall. The normal tone of the detrusor muscle in the bladder wall tends to compress the ureter, thereby preventing backflow or reflux of urine from the bladder when pressure builds up in the bladder during micturition or bladder compression. Each peristaltic wave along the ureter increases the pressure within the ureter so that the region is passing through the bladder wall opens and allows urine to flow into the bladder. In some people, the distance that the ureter course through the bladder wall is less than normal, and this contraction of the bladder during micturition does not always lead to complete occlusion of the ureter. As a result, some of the urine in the bladder is propelled backward into the ureter, a condition called vesico-urethral reflux. Such reflux can lead to enlargement of ureters and, if severe, can increase the pressure on the renal calyces and the structures of the renal medulla, causing damage to these regions. Then pain sensation in the ureters and the urinorenal reflex. The ureters are well supplied with pain nerve fibers. When a ureter becomes blocked by a urethral stone, intense reflex constriction occurs, which is associated with severe pain. Also, the pain impulses cause a sympathetic reflex back to the kidney to constrict the renal arterioles, thereby decreasing urine output from the kidney. This effect is called the ureterorenal reflex and is important for preventing excessive flow of fluid into the pelvis of a kidney with a blocked ureter. Next topic we will be learning with the help of next video.